So I listened to the Penguin edition of this audiobook, and it talks about classical anarchist thought. There's not like a body of philosophy behind anarchism in the same way that there is about Marxism. And he talks about that in the introduction, whoever wrote the introduction. He said they talk about Bakunin, they talk about Proudhon, and they talk about Kropotkin, because those are really the big three. Yeah. And he says that only Kropotkin really had this kind of stint towards communism in a way that was long-lasting throughout history and was influential to other movements in history. Not that Bakunin and Proudhon didn't have their own influence.
Yeah, without Proudhon, there wouldn't have been Kropotkin also,
right. Yeah, totally fair. But it's interesting because Kropotkin inspired anarchists not only in the Spanish Civil War, but also in the Occupy Wall Street movement. David Graeber, whose book I had recently read, The Dawn of Everything, which is really fantastic, about the historical roots of inequality, specifically cites this book and Peter Kropotkin as a direct inspiration for what they were trying to accomplish in Occupy. And I've heard some of the critique of Occupy is their disorganization. You know, maybe that's their anarchist side of things there. You know?
Here we go.
Yeah. Sorry, buckos.
Hello.
Hey, welcome.
Welcome to Left Unread, a podcast where
two of Stalin's strongest soldiers further entrench themselves in the rocky milieu of scientific socialism.
That's fucking great.
Two burgeoning Trotskyists slowly chip away at the calcified remnants of state socialism. Woo!
Two dudes engage in radical self-education. That's great.
Yeah, thank you. I felt it. Because I was thinking about intros, and I was like, we should just say something absolutely fucking ridiculous. At first, I was like, maybe we could throw it back to the last episode, be like, we're two barricade builders on the streets of Paris. You know? I don't know.
Oh, I kind of like that.
Yeah,
it's always a reference to the last episode.
That could be fun, but I don't want to like have to reach for it, you know?
It's like yet another thing that we'd have to like prepare and have ready.
I'll think about it.
Well, we still have, obviously, we can't even come up with a fucking sign-off that we like.
Who cares? That's half the fun. I'm Will.
I'm Aaron.
This is Left Unread. We're engaging in radical self-education. This week we read
The Conquest of Bread.
That's right, by Peter Kropotkin.
Piotr.
Peter. I've seen it spelled 6 different ways, you know, just today alone.
We're going to anglicize it. We're just going to call him Peter.
Peter.
Yeah, Peter Kropotkin. And full disclosure, one of the few leftists that I had done some reading on before we started this podcast, really. Like, I had never read any Lenin. I had never read any Engels. I certainly had never read any Trotsky before. I had read a little bit of this before this episode. I've read Mutual Aid as well. Another pretty pivotal book in his repertoire. Oeuvre.
Yes.
And so, I came into this already with, I would say, a slight positive bias toward Kropotkin. Maybe you came in with a slight negative bias against Kropotkin.
So that's the interesting thing is that, you know, much in the same way, I also have read very little, but this is one of the books that I had read before. And I don't view it in a negative light at all. I mean, I don't view Kropotkin in a negative light, even for a filthy anarchist. I don't, you know, I think that, and I'm sure we'll talk about this again and again and again today, but these ideas go hand in hand with the same ideas that we, capital W-E being all MLs of the world uniting, they're the same things. Like, they're the same things basically, just with a little bit of the how-to in the mix.
Yeah, I was going to say that one thing that I wrote here as a note to myself is that I think the timeline is very important to understanding how we discuss Kropotkin, recognizing that he predates. The writing of this book predates the Russian Revolution by far.
Yeah.
He is writing in response to the Paris Commune, just like other MLs. But I do think it's important to recognize that he's coming at it from a lens where the Bolsheviks have not yet taken power, taken claim of what was happening in Russia.
Yeah. It's interesting because when he talks about existing socialism, he's talking about these nominally socialist states of the time, you know, basically. Sometimes it can be hard, I think, in the reading of this, when he's critiquing state socialism, to think of like the Marxist states, whatever, that came out later in history, but he's actually referring to, I guess, parliamentary socialism or social democracy. and that's something that I kind of had to cache in my reading of this, thinking about the way he's talking about the state. Because even though he's clearly anti-statist in this, I still think that the state that he's referring to is a reflection of the current period that he's living in, much in the same way the state that Lenin was referring to in State and Revolution is not the same state that he's wishing to build post-revolution, much in the same way Kropotkin's wishing to build a state post-revolution, but he's not calling it a state. I think that maybe there's some language issues going on here, because...
In translation, you mean, or you think Kropotkin is deliberately using language in a way that's...
I don't think he's doing it in a way that's meant to be misleading. I think that basically when Kropotkin is referring to a state or an organization or a government, I mean, outside of his critique of collectivism, I think, he is referring to a state that is existing in the same sense that Lenin was referring to, as in, like, the current state that these bourgeois democracies and other countries have. Like, that's what he means by a state. Whereas, say, the revolution happens, and then the two trains of thought have now split, because Lenin's saying build a state that does communism, but Kropotkin's saying do communism, no state needed. You know what I'm saying? I think that it's a little odd here, because I think we maybe have... I don't know, I felt like the water was a little muddied having read State and Revolution, because my thought was always like, we're looking to build a state that's not really a state, like it's withering away.
Yeah, Lenin's whole view is like, use the state apparatus post-revolution, use the existing state apparatus that is there. It will just now be controlled by the workers to the point that it can ultimately wither away. Yeah. And the workers will still remain, as a majority, as a power. Where Kropotkin says, if it's going to wither away, I mean, he doesn't say it this way, but he says, if our aim is for it to wither away, why not just reject it outright?
But I mean, it's interesting because both of them say smash the original state, which, I mean, I agree with. Okay, but then what is the question?
Yeah.
And I think Lenin has like a formulated plan where he's saying the organized masses will essentially rule, right? They'll have an organization that is above society, meaning like, I guess the bourgeois in this case, because now that government is what is oppressing, it's one class oppressing the other, but it's no longer the minority oppressing the majority, it's now the majority oppressing the minority. Whereas Kropotkin's saying, we'll do a revolution and then we will have an organization where everyone is taken care of, and that's it. It seems unstructured. I feel like I got way in the weeds there.
No, I think I understand your ultimate point, and I tend to agree with it. I also think you were right in that it's going to be hard to contextualize this conversation without contextualizing it around Lenin and the State and Revolution, which is maybe a little unfair to Kropotkin.
Yeah.
But it'll be what it's going to be. I actually think, like, what I was going to say was my ultimate takeaway from reading this now, which was the first time I've read it in its entirety.
Yes.
So reading it now, my ultimate takeaway is that I actually think Kropotkin is right in a lot of his criticisms of the state. And I think Stalinism is a good point to demonstrate exactly how Kropotkin was right in his arguments against the state. And while I don't think Kropotkin necessarily offers a concrete plan of what it should be, like you said, will the real anarchist please stand up? Like, the problem with the philosophy of anarchism is that it is a philosophy, in the ether. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a concrete philosophy in the same way that, say, Marxism is. And Kropotkin, I think, has reasonable reservations with the state, but he doesn't necessarily offer a counter to what it should be.
Yeah.
Other than it shouldn't be is his counterpoint.
Yeah, it's in the negative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that, like, coming back and reading this now, my big takeaway was we should think more about the potential for the state to become the coercive force that it's trying to fight against in a post-revolution world.
Totally.
Kropotkin was right to call it in that sort of way. I just wish he would have defined it a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, I think that there's an interesting parallel between what you just said. It's like, say we're holding these two things opposite, right? Anarchism and communism, or Marxism, Leninism, I guess. It's interesting because their theoretical principles kind of reflect the same issues that we're talking about, right? The MLs have like a party line, a program, a single idea, whereas the anarchist thought is all over the place. I mean,
because it's individualistic.
Yeah. Secondly, to think about, I think that what you said is poignant, because looking at like the New Left movement, that's exactly the thing they were trying to do. They were concerned with what political form will, allow this I mean, like the form of politics matters, and it will give way to the new society. So they were thinking very severely about that forms. In If We Burn, Vincent Bevins talks about that exact thing. The reason that you see a lot of these horizontal mass movements is because they were really worried about tyranny. Like they were worried about a structured tyranny in the hierarchies. And like that negation of structure is in direct relation to what they were seeing in the Soviet Union. I mean, they were reacting essentially to Stalinism in the popular conception, at least. And that's what caused them to want to build these very horizontal, very structureless societies, or governments or forms, I guess. So I don't know. It's interesting that we're kind of grappling with this the same kind of historical struggle. And there's actually a really interesting quote that Kropotkin has in here. We haven't even introduced him or the book.
We haven't.
Do you want to do that first?
Yeah, we probably should.
Yeah.
Okay, before we get into it, let's talk a little bit about the man and the book, Peter Kropotkin. He has a really interesting biography, by the way, which is a little convoluted if you really read into it.
Yeah.
Peter Alexievich Kropotkin was born in 1842 into Russian nobility. His father, a wealthy aristocrat, and his mother, the daughter of a well-known Russian general. At a young age, Kropotkin felt a kinship with the serfs serving under his family, and after leaving home to study geography, he ultimately eschewed the life of nobility bestowed upon him, writing early in his studies for the emancipation of serfs, ultimately aligning with the International Working Men's Association and the Jura Foundation, which I had not heard of before this, being imprisoned for his revolutionary writing in 1874. After escaping prison, which is becoming a motif with all of these guys. After escaping prison, Kropotkin fled to England, where he lived and wrote for most of his remaining life, though he did move back to Russia briefly in 1917 after the February Revolution and had correspondence with Lenin, which is pretty interesting. And then he died.
Yes. I mean, he's a really interesting figure, and I'm happy that there's at least one anarchist who shows up as the anarchist, the guy.
I mean, knowing that Proudhon, Bukharin, and Kropotkin are kind of the holy trinity of anarchists, I haven't read What is Property or whatever, the seminal Proudhon text or whatever, but reading about him in the Paris Commune, I have no real interest in reading much of Proudhon's work. And so it's nice to actually hold an anarchist up that I think has something worthwhile to say.
Yeah, I had mentioned that I think it's, these ideas go hand in hand with the things that we already believe, So much so that I think my focus reading this was really his disdain for the government. I was trying to pinpoint what is the form of state that he was looking for, because I already am in agreement with everything he says about food, clothing, and dwellings, basically. Although there is an interesting point he makes about rent in there, about the way that, like, these revolutions still were charging rent. That is interesting. But going back to Kropotkin as a whole, I just like him. He seems like he seems like a cool dude.
He does seem like a cool guy.
He's a class trader too. He was also a prince, right?
Yeah, that's what he was like legit born into the aristocracy.
Yeah.
And what I was reading about him, he was like 12 years old, and after his mother died, his stepmother was like very cold and distant toward Kropotkin and his siblings, and that was part of what led Kropotkin to become much closer with the serfs that worked under his family. And while that was happening, he was just kind of like, this is fucked up. You shouldn't be living like this.
Not to get all Freudian, but in the Penguin introduction, they say that seeing his father's aggression and hypocrisy was part of the reason of his disdain for authority. I hate the idea that he's just an anarchist because he has daddy issues, but perhaps no, I'm joking, of course. I was just about to say, just to speak on the Conquest of Bread, it was written as a bunch of essays, as a lot of these works are, I guess, in the 1800s, that's one of the main ways to get published. But it was written in the newspaper and then subsequently compiled into one thing, So, the Conquest of Bread.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's not a bad place to start. Really, the biggest thing that he talks about is you got to have bread. You got to have something to eat.
Yeah, I really appreciated how, I don't know that I would call it humble or like down to earth, his approach to this sort of theory is. There are a couple of quotes in here that I couldn't find when I was going back to it, where he effectively says, like, it's all well and good to talk the theory.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But, like, people are fucking hungry.
Right.
So they need food. Give the people food. I appreciate that kind of common sense, straightforward, down to earth approach to revolutionary practice.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that it really strikes at one of the most important things, and is that you need the mass support. I mean, if there's anything we've seen so far, it's that the revolution has to come from the people, right? It has to include the people, even if it's being led by a vanguard or whatever. The mass of support is really what makes or breaks the revolution, and something that Kropotkin says in here is that if they don't, then the reaction is all the more stronger. Especially if revolutionaries aren't fed, then the bourgeois will come and say, "Look at your revolution now. How is it going? You're even more wretched than before. Like, if you thought you were bad then, just look at you now." Like, that's the kind of thing that kills a revolution. Bread is really the main thing there. Bread.
Yeah. So I had written the question that I thought might guide us a little bit, like what sets Kropotkin apart from other Marxists? Obviously, his anarchist leanings, I think, are the big part of that. But I think that this is kind of his philosophy. If I was going to try to sum up what is its primary theme, is that the people need bread, the people need time for leisure, and the state needs to be destroyed.
Yeah, there's enough for everybody is a really common theme here. We are already communists, so like this argument, it's not that it's lost on us, but we already are accepting of this. But he spends a lot of this book talking about the fact that there is enough to feed everybody. There is enough to go around. It's not a matter of production, it's a matter of distribution. I mean, this is all well-trodden ground for us, but I'm just imagining being like a working man in the 1800s. Maybe this is the kind of thing that I would need to convince, and he does a lot of like napkin math talking about there's enough produce for everybody. Even if we're talking about like real hard numbers, there is enough for everybody. He speaks constantly of technological advancements, the way that poor soil can be turned into new product, or the way that like technology can make us produce more for less. I mean, he really strikes at the core of like, this is a distributional issue. Men have enough technology, power, chutzpah, whatever, to feed and take care of everybody's needs. It's just a matter of doing it, and in his view, at least, like the only thing stopping us is this embodiment of oppression, the state. It's not that the state is the only thing stopping it. He's clearly aware of the fact that the means of production have been seized by the few. In fact, he says that very early on page 5. Let's get some quotes in here.
Yeah, I have a couple of quotes on the next page, too, that I think are kind of related to this.
Yeah, I love this quote, though. He says, "The socialists have said it and repeated it unwearyingly. All have been seized by the few in the course of that long story of robbery, enforced migration and wars, of ignorance and oppression, which has been the life of the human race before it had learned to subdue the forces of nature."
Yep.
There's a long history of us corralling nature, and in that same enclosure, you might say, we've also enclosed ourselves.
Poignant, poetic.
Yes. That was that's like part of the birth of capitalism, is they enclosed the public lands in the UK. They did enclosure.
Yeah, so I marked a couple of quotes on the next page here, because the thing that really stood out to me, and maybe speaks to what you're saying, on page 6, he says, "Every root of soil we cultivate in Europe has been watered by the sweat of several races of men. Every acre has its story of enforced labor, of intolerable toil, of the people's sufferings. Every mile of railway, every yard of tunnel has received its share of human blood." And then at the bottom of page 6, that last paragraph there, he says, "Millions of human beings have labored to create this civilization on which we pride ourselves today. Other millions, scattered through the globe, labor to maintain it. Without them, nothing would be left in 50 years but ruins."
Yeah.
And I wrote, my margin note was, "Capitalism made my iPad," because this fucking argument that you hear from people all the time, where it's like, "I'm not against capitalism. Capitalism made my MacBook."
Yeah.
It's like, no, it didn't. The fucking people made your
Right.
MacBook, asshole. He even goes into this in great length here. All of that innovation that historically has led to where we are currently technologically has come from the blood, sweat, and toil of the workers in previous years. No one person, no one ideology necessarily is responsible for that. It's the collective action of the people working together in tandem.
Yeah, and if we want to be especially pedantic, which I do, most of the funding for that innovation came from the government.
Fuck yes.
Yeah, so, that's mostly to rail against like the capitalist entrepreneur type deal, because, most of that shit is subsidized anyway by the government. So
and subsidized by birth lottery.
Yeah, well, no doubt there. I love this same quote on page 6. "Who can tell what each of these graves have cost in tears, in privations, in unspeakable wretchedness to the family who depended on the scanty wage of the worker, cut off in his prime? by fire, damp, rockfall, or flood.
Yep.
I mean, again, Kropotkin is on the same page as us. I mean, he knows the exploitation wrought by capitalism well.
Yep.
Just continuing this idea, like we stand on the shoulders of giants. Up near the top, he says, every new invention is a synthesis, the result of innumerable inventions which have proceeded in the vast field of mechanics and industry. And I was just thinking about, I don't know, this continuous building process. Everything we live on is coming from that, and everything we should be building should be coming from that in the same way. I think that a lot of communists strive to have that kind of self-reflection, self-building, self-improvement in their ideology, or I guess it's kind of baked in there.
I mean, if they're doing good self-crit,
Yeah.
Yeah, I also appreciate that that's coming in the opening, like the very first essay that he's written here, is just establishing these are the basic foundational truths that we're going to move forward from.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's convincing. The first time I read this, I was much less of a communist than I am now, and it was much more inspiring then, obviously. But it is really nice. I mean, you know, that's just something that we've said about most of these writings, is that the audience is typically a layperson, you know, someone that needs convincing.
Yeah, and again, I think situating Kropotkin in the timeline of what we're talking about with socialism is important here, and I think is an important part of context for him.
Mm-hmm.
There is another quote here on page 9 that I liked a lot as well, which I think is where he's beginning to pepper in his anti-state sentiment.
Yeah.
At the end of the first full paragraph, he says, "And if the children of those who perished by thousands while excavating the railway cuttings and tunnels were to assemble one day, crowding in their rags and hunger to demand bread from the shareholders, they would be met with bayonets and grape shot to disperse them and safeguard, quote, vested interests."
Mm-hmm.
And how this is no secret to either of us, or I would say anyone in the modern world that has eyes that are open, that the mechanisms of militarism are used to defend the vested interest of the state.
Yeah.
The fucking plutocrats, the aristocracy, whatever you want to call them, the oligarchs, will come out guns blazing once they feel like their shit is in peril. And the state will back it up. See Israel, the United States.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same thing that has been said in almost all of these texts. I love the quote on page 10. A vast array of courts, judges, executioners, policemen, and jailers is needed to uphold these privileges. And this array gives rise in turn to a whole system of espionage, a false witness, of spies, of threats, and of corruption. In the same way that Lenin says, like, the state exists to allow the suppression to happen.
Yep.
And I like that he takes it a step further here, and it's like that structure being in place is also creating this kind of substructure. You know, this layer beneath it that's now a part of our society just because it's happened because of the existence of the structure above it. You know, and you can't, just like you said, you can start to see Kropotkin and start to rail on the state here. I also love, even at the bottom, it keeps going back to that same thing. Just like Lenin said, the golden rule is well known. It's preached by everybody, preached being the operative word there. The quote at page 10 says, "Fine sermons have been preached on the text that those who have should share with those who have not. But he who would carry out this principle would be speedily informed that these beautiful sentiments are all very well in poetry, but not in practice." Well, that works great in theory, but human nature. Yeah, to lie is to degrade and besmirch oneself, we say, yet all civilized life becomes one huge lie.
That was my favorite part of that.
Yeah, it's so real. Like, the way that we fucking form our own cognitive dissonance around the fact that everything is okay. There are people that exist in this world that think the system is working as intended. Don't get me wrong, so do I. But I don't think it's the same intention that they're saying.
Yeah, we are coming to that conclusion from vastly different vantage points.
Right. Yeah. No one needs to be said on that.
I love that we're just kind of quote crawling here. So we're on page 11.
Yes, we've just gone through the first chapter. But I think that like truly is the basis of this, is that like everything that Kropotkin is saying is something that we agree with. It's something that goes hand in hand with what any communist believes.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I think it's very clear to me going through this again why Kropotkin is the figure that he is.
Yeah.
Much in the same way that reading State and Revolution was getting me all jazzed up.
It's
And I was like, I fucking get
this
it.
This is why Lenin is Lenin. Yeah.
I felt the same way here. I don't think that he has the same zeal as a writer that Lenin did.
Mm-hmm.
We have yet to read anything that has topped State and Revolution.
Dude, he was going absolutely nutty. Yeah.
In its fervor, but I did like this a lot. There is another quote on 11 that I like. And it's the all belongs to all
Mm.
bit that he closes a paragraph with. He says, individual appropriation is neither just nor serviceable. All belongs to all. All things are for all men, since all men have need of them, since all men have worked in the measure of their strength to produce them, and since it is not possible to evaluate everyone's part in the production of the world's wealth.
Yeah.
And he's going to kind of expand on that last idea there a little bit later. I marked it in my notes as just like all work is work. But when he gets deeper into the book, he starts talking about the division of labor, and he calls it like brain work versus manual work or something like that. And he comes down, I think, very rightly on the side that all work is work, and fuck all these people that are trying to pretend that they're better than others. I don't know.
No, I absolutely agree with
that.
you. I mean, he's ultra egalitarian in that sense. I mean, and I would agree. It's interesting because he talks about Marxist conceptions of the separation of labor in that sense, and that's something I have no knowledge of. You know, I simply don't know.
The cost of production. He keeps coming back to this phrase, the cost of production, and using that as how others use that as a justification for paying an engineer more than a manual laborer or something like that, because the cost of their production is higher. But Kropotkin argues that that's all a bunch of bullshit, and what you're seeing there is workers then using the mechanisms of capital, in this case, capital being like their diplomas, as a mechanism of oppressing or gaining power over others.
Yeah, and it's odd. Well, what I was going to say is about the idea of cost of production, I think, is not one that is super well fleshed out. What little Marx I've read, he is very aware of the idea of like the amount of time that goes into the production as well. The example I think you're referencing is on page 146, where he says a corporation would say, here are 100 tons of steel. 100 workmen are required to produce them, and it took them 10 days. Their work day being in 8 hours.
An 8 hours day.
Yes, it has taken them 8,000 working hours to produce 100 tons of steel at 8 hours a ton. On the other hand, down a paragraph, 100 miners having taken 20 days to extract 8,000 tons of coal would be worth 2 hours a ton. That kind of divide is something that Marx explicitly addresses. He's saying it's not talking, Marx literally says, if someone were to try to rebut this idea of labor being the basis of value, then the amount of time would just be expanded. We could take twice as long and it would be worth twice as much. If that's like an argument that someone would say against what Marx is saying. And Marx is saying that we're not talking about specific amounts of time in specific examples, but an average of labor time across the industry. I don't know. I hate to get so granular there, but I feel that I don't think it's a malicious example that Kropotkin is making here, but I just don't necessarily think it's the same understanding of value that Marx is trying to put out there in his writing.
Understood. I agree that I don't think that it's coming from bad faith or it's in any way malicious against Marx. And I think that Kropotkin's take on it, let's just go to those quotes, fuck it. I was on page 148. We have said that certain collectivist writers desire that a distinction should be made between qualified or professional work and simple work. They pretend that an hour's work of an engineer, an architect, or a doctor must be considered as 2 or 3 hours' work of a blacksmith, a mason, or a hospital nurse, and the same distinction must be made between all sorts of trades, necessitating apprenticeship and the simple toil of day laborers. And he goes on, he says sort of the same thing a couple of times in these next few pages, but I think his ultimate point is that maybe this is like part of the criticism of Kropotkin, or maybe anarchism in general, where he's criticizing the ideology of like, Marxism to a certain degree, but he doesn't offer the necessary counterpoint. Yeah. I think his ultimate point here is just like, fuck that, work is work. Right. It's unfair to argue that an engineer's time is more valuable than a blacksmith's, because both of them produce something that's valuable and necessary for society. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think also somewhere in here I wrote a margin note about like the Mike Rowe workers of the world. Do you know who Mike Rowe is? The dirty jobs guy?
Of course.
So all of these mostly white, middle-aged, blue-collar guys that are like strongly in favor of the trades and talk about like college isn't for everybody. Go to the trades, learn a trade, do something valuable. I'm like, these are the sorts of fucks that need to be reading Kropotkin and see that like there is something here for you in this sort of theory, because I think they would agree with Kropotkin in that estimation.
Completely tangential.
We're all over the place.
Yeah, I know, dude. Mike Rowe, fucking funded by libertarians.
Yeah, I knew a little bit about that.
Yeah, really fucked up stuff. If you're still on my Patreon, I listen to Citations Needed on there, and they have a fantastic episode about how Mike Rowe is funded by the fucking Koch brothers.
Yeah.
Same with Stossel, and that was obvious, but like Stossel in the Classroom is like a Liberty Foundation fucking funded project. It's funny, though, because there are parts in this book where I think Kropotkin doesn't go far enough, and that might be a crazy thing to say, but a great example of that is his discussion of wages. I wanted to talk about wages, money, and labor notes for a second, because I think ultimately to consider a society that still has money is to kind of miss the purpose. This idea that we still have a transaction exchange-based society is maybe not the ultimate goal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the idea of a labor note being just a replacement of a wage might be missing the point. What might be a better system is one where if you do 8 hours of work, say, you just get a check that says you have done 8 hours of work, and then you can shop without dividing and exchanging. Like, wouldn't that be a better system? Why make it a wage at all? Much in the same way, there is a quote in here where Kropotkin says that millions of transactions happen without the enforcement of the government.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, why are we still aiming for a society with transactions? Aren't we looking for a society in which everyone is taken care of? I don't know. There's a disconnect that I have between the kind of grand scale mutual aid that he expects and the lack of organization.
I think I get what you're saying. My take on this, I agree. I will agree with your fundamental assessment that if it's not classless, moneyless, and stateless, then it's not what I want.
Mm-hmm.
A labor note is still a form of currency, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Some sort of labor note or currency that is still being used in a transactional manner, then you're not hitting the moneyless and I would argue stateless, like, because how are you managing all of that?
Yeah.
You're not hitting those key points, what we need. I guess I read this completely differently than you did, because I wasn't taking Kropotkin's position as one of like in favor of the labor notes.
No, I think he's certainly critiquing the labor notes there.
Okay.
But it's just interesting. This actually kind of speaks to what you were just saying, where he goes against these ideas, but doesn't put anything in the place of them. I kept thinking about a load-bearing we in this, because there's so many times where Kropotkin says, we will do these things.
Mhm.
We, being society, will feed everybody. We will, I don't know. And it's body. There is no
That I would agree that it's like allowing everyone to do what they want. I think Kropotkin's he goes into this more in mutual aid, so maybe I'm bringing that into this conversation, is that like mutual aid, he talks a lot about studying insect life and animal life and seeing that they work collectively for the betterment of their kind of society, so to speak. And so like when left alone, when literally left to a state of nature, people will do for others what they need to survive, because I mean, again, you could argue the benevolence of that, but it's like coming from a position of rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing.
I love that phrase, by the way. And he does make plenty of clear examples of that, happening. One thing he says is that there's a trend in society towards that kind of anarchic communism anyway.
Talks about the railways.
Yeah,
quite extensively.
Quite a few. I wrote this down on page 25. New organizations based on the same principle, to every man according to his needs, spring up under 1,000 different forms. For without a certain leaven of communism, the present societies could not exist. So he's saying that like that instinct still exists in everybody, and I absolutely agree. On the next page, he gives a bunch of examples. Public libraries, public museums. He's talking about in St. Petersburg, there's open and public workshops for inventors. As long as you say, I have an idea, they'll give you tools, they'll give you space. His huge example is the Lifeboat Association here. In the same way, those who man the lifeboat do not ask credentials from the crew of a sinking ship. They launch their boat, risk their lives in the raging waves, and sometimes perish, all to save men for whom they do not even know. And what need to know them? They are human beings, and they need our aid. That is enough. That establishes their right to the rescue.
Yeah.
So I absolutely agree with Kropotkin that those kinds of examples exist all over society already. It's just very strange to think that, I don't know, the scale of those free associative organizations can meet the demand of everybody.
I don't know. I mean, I think his argument is much more around, he's definitely he uses the word commune quite regularly throughout. And I think what his point is that you don't need a larger state apparatus to direct the communes. You let the communes direct themselves.
Sure.
And so it's not necessarily about like leaving folks to do whatever they want. I think he's saying in a small society, people will structure it to fit the needs that they need without having that sort of opportunity for tyranny, that kind of opportunity that presents itself with a vanguard or with some sort of state apparatus that then has some level of power over the commune and therefore like is corruptible.
Yeah, he says this on page... Yeah, here we go. On page 28, the problem that I have is that he says that this is insoluble. But he says towards the bottom of page 28, the problem of constructing a government which will constrain the individual to obedience without itself ceasing to be a servant of society.
Yeah.
That is quite an interesting conception of a government. Again, I'm thinking about what Lenin is saying about any organized form of one class against the other will be a form of a state. So,
well, he does say on 29 right after that in the second full paragraph there at the end, I think what his point here is that he's saying people object to a stateless conception of society in large part because it's like a state realism or something like that. They've been made to believe that there's no other way. He says, we have all been brought up from our childhood to regard the state as a sort of providence. All our education, the Roman history we learned at school, the Byzantine code, which we studied later under the name of Roman law, and the various sciences taught at the universities, accustom us to believe in capital G government and in the virtues of the state providential. And I think like that's what he's railing against.
Yeah.
Using the word providence really stood out to me.
Yeah.
Almost like holy divinity or something.
Yeah. I think again that this is the same thing I was talking about earlier, though, is that I don't know, the state I have in my mind is not the same one.
Yeah.
It's like if we're creating an organized society,
then you're saying like I'm finally understanding what you're
I'm so sorry.
No, I just think I don't know. But your point, we said this in another episode, like at a certain point,
it's not the state anymore.
It's no longer the state. Why call it the state?
Yeah, why call it the state?
I get that.
Yeah. It's just so tough because, again, Kropotkin doesn't put anything in the place of what he's destroying.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I think his take would be like, leave it to the people to decide. But obviously that leaves a lot to be desired if you're like, okay, what do I do?
Well, yeah. Okay. And also, there's so many things here. I spent so much reading this book just being like, what are you, like, who is always the question I had in my mind. You know, there's so much enforcement that he assumes happens passively just by the will of the people. Mm-hmm. There's so many things that he just assumes will happen because there's that societal we proclaim that it should happen. You know, we will proclaim that the rights of humans are above all. We proclaim that everybody has the right to a good, healthy life. But how does that happen? Like, what creates those things? What allows that distribution?
Yeah.
You know, that's always the question that's on my mind reading this, because who is doing this? Is it just a bunch of free communal associative institutions? Like, there's so many issues with that I can't, you know, there's like a Gordian knot that I can't unravel here. You know, especially when it comes to big picture things. Like the thing that came to me in this reading that didn't come to me in the last one is the fucking environment. Okay? If we're going to stop climate change or revert climate change or live in any kind of world after this, how can that happen without a plan? You know, how can that happen without a structure? I don't think it'll happen spontaneously. And I mean, that's like a one-off example, but it's those kinds of things that I feel the need for some kind of central planning for. And back to that question that he's saying is that I do think that it's possible to create a system that allows for command without oppression. You know, I think that there is a subjection to authority that happens naturally, even communally, right? Even in a structureless society, like there are still leaders or people that take charge, you know, those things still exist. I've lost my track. I've lost my train of thought here. Fucking hell.
I have some responses to all of that.
Yeah.
Hit me, see if I can remember all of them.
Dude, I know.
So number one, I think climate change is a really good example of a thing that requires organization, because we have moved ourselves. We have created the conditions where it is no longer something that can resolve itself without intervention. I think we can let Kropotkin off the hook with that one a little bit.
Sure, certainly, yes. It's so funny, though. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I was just thinking about climate communism. Like, literally, that's like a Fox News thing where they're like,
Really?
yeah, the climate communist regime, like they're going to put all these fucking regulations on us to stop climate change. And that's why they did that's why they've drummed up the climate change hoax in the first place. So the government can put all their evil communist restrictions on us. But I'm unironically saying that.
I can't believe people fucking buy that shit. But anyway, yeah, that is a human-created problem that will require a plan. It will require organized response that will most likely come through the action of a state. Whatever this state apparatus is that we're talking about, right? Like, it has to come from organized leaders in a space. The point about authority and inside a commune, even inside a commune, people will like respond to figures of authority or something like that. There will always be like a leader of some sort. I think that there's truth to that as well, in large part because the authority that we're responding to most of the time comes from education and experience.
Yeah.
And so like, I believe that I am capable of doing a leg amputation if someone like gets into a fight with a bear or something like that. But I also recognize that if there is a doctor nearby who is a surgeon, their experience and education is an authority to which I will defer. You know what I mean? Like, so I think like there are natural states of, well, that's not a natural thing. Education isn't a natural thing, but you get my point. Like there are positions of authority or situations of authority where we will defer to one another. And part of that will come from some people are really good at organizing and other people are not.
Sure.
And so like there probably will be someone that gets voted in as, you know.
But hold on, Johnson, because you just voted somebody in. Yeah. You've just elected a representative. That goes completely against the kind of state that, I mean, that's the state that Kropotkin's fucking talking about,
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. So like, I think that there is, even in a commune space, I think like part of this maybe comes from the fact that like we exist in the space we exist in now. And so like we will act in a way that corresponds with our experience. So we'll have some form of directly representative democracy. Yeah. You know, it's probably the way that we would make decisions. You know what I mean? Which from a zoomed out perspective is a form of the state. I'm not going to mince words quite so much with Kropotkin in that case. I think like his problem is against this providence that he's talking about. His argument is against this conception of the state as something that does no harm and is required for all humanity to survive. Yeah. Where he says most of the time, if you actually just eliminate the state from your conception of what's happening, people are doing just fine. You know?
Yes. Okay. So, okay. So yes. Yeah, I agree. People can exist without bureaucracy. That's no problem. But the thing is that Kropotkin is so quick to thumb his nose at any form of government. I think he's like letting perfect be the enemy of good. You know, the commune is not a perfect example here, but in the commune of 1871, again, they died in 2 months. It's impossible to say how they would have turned out. Yeah. But even that like democratic workers' government or whatever, Kropotkin's like, no, they're doing a government there. He does have specific examples. And I think it's interesting. He talks about one of the failures of the commune being the fact that there was a differentiation in the pay between the council members and the people on the ramparts. Yeah. Which is funny because it goes against what Marx is saying, or I guess Lenin, about the commune where they paid everyone 15 shillings or whatever. That was interesting to see. I'm glad Kropotkin mentioned that because it is a direct failing of the commune. It's a direct failing of that government. That's the kind of critique that I need. But going back to what like Marx or Engels or Lenin was saying, it's like anarchists are so afraid of that political power that they'll destroy it even when it works in their favor.
I mean, that's definitely what we saw with Proudhon. Yeah. And the commune. He does talk about the commune. I have a couple of quotes on page 20 that he mentions. Okay. First of all, yeah, maybe he's being a little cheeky at the top of page 20, but he's talking about like the commune as a stage show almost. He says, all this may please those who like the stage, but it is not revolution. Right. Nothing has been accomplished yet. And then at the bottom of that page near the end of this section, he says, and one could cast a reproach at the Paris Commune, which was born beneath the Prussian cannon and lasted only 70 days, it would be for this same error, this failure to understand that the revolution could not triumph unless those who fought on its side were fed, that on 15 pence a day, a man cannot fight on the ramparts and at the same time support a family.
Yeah. This is a tough discussion because when I was reading this, I had like a lot of anger is not the right word, but I was like, this is wrong. And now I don't know how to express that clearly.
I think, so here's what I would say based on where we're at so far. I think I would generally agree that it is a reasonable criticism of Kropotkin's writing here in The Conquest of Bread, that he does too much of, we know what we're against, but what are we for? He does too much of that, which I think is a pretty common anarchist failing, and a line from one of my favorite bands, Lucitude.
Love it.
I would agree with that. And I think we're on the same page there. I think your reaction is to move much more quickly toward a statist solution, like a Leninist state socialism, where I still am more reticent to like immediately move into those sorts of larger sweeping moves.
Yeah.
I'm more on his anarchist side than I think you are.
Something I was thinking about earlier is, you just mentioned speed, and it's unrelated to that, but
Did I?
You said you're quick to move to a statist thing, and I think that speed is actually a factor that it comes into my consideration here, because I think that a concentration of authority is a reflection of like the speed of the ability to do things. You know, you can come to consensus about everything. It will just take a long time.
Yeah.
You know, I do think that there's a possibility for consensus not to be reached. That's a different occasion though. Okay. Whereas on the flip side, like an autocrat can do something immediately, you know? And I think that maybe what I'm saying is that the context of a revolution, the context of what we are looking for, the context of the construction of a new society requires some kind of speed, some kind of actionability that maybe anarchic organization cannot inspire. That's kind of where my feelings are at, because you see so much of this reaction coming in and quashing revolution that I do think some anarchic political form could work out. And I think that ultimately, in the end of the day, in the high stage of communism, that is the goal.
Yeah.
Right. But I think that transitionary period, maybe, you know, even just to speak in the in between here, maybe that anarchic form is not best suited to the transition. That's maybe my most nuanced take. Sorry, to have the past half hour of fucking schizo rambling dissolved into one fucking final point. But that's kind of where I'm at right now. And especially, doubling back on climate change, that's also something that requires a speed of action.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think I agree. I think I agree with that. I mean, certainly the reading that we've done so far skews us in one direction over the other.
Absolutely.
But I would agree, and I think the Paris Commune and their inability to even come up with a fucking stance.
No, they can't even get a program.
Yeah. Let alone the strength and speed of action to take Versailles is evidence that you need some sort of expedience and ability to make decisions quickly and rightly and quickly, you know, which is very difficult when you're talking about trying to reach absolute consensus.
Yes. On top of that, but going back to that load-bearing we that Kropotkin keeps having, it's like, how do we decide what to do? You know, is there some kind of communicative organization, something that some interlinking fiber that allows all of these communes to work together? Is that not just a government? Like, that's that same thing we're going back to. The problem is that even in Kropotkin's conception, I think that there is still government there. They're just thinking of it in a different way. Much in the same way that Lenin's critique of anarchists is that they can't just change the name from an authority to a commission and have the power be destroyed. I think that that's the same kind of thing going on here, is that in that act of us, of we doing something, of we creating the society, like that's a structure in its own right.
Sure. Yeah, I guess. I think my take on that is the difference between cooperation and coercion.
Yeah.
I think Kropotkin sees the state as a coercive force, and it's insoluble in its coercion,
well, okay.
to use this language, where it is possible for two communes to choose to cooperate. And the ultimate thing is probably the same, that it looks like two communes working in
I'm getting
commune.
ready, Johnson. I'm about to strike the nail. Okay, because here's the thing, man.
Yeah.
I think that his conception of cooperation is coercion. I think that it is. Here's my example. Let's go to page 137, where he talks about the enforcement of these anarchistic principles, perhaps.
Oh, I think I've got some of this highlighted here.
So he talks about a couple of things. First, earlier in the chapter, let's actually go back, page 119 first. So in section 3, page 119, he says, the Dutch settled matters in a more practical way. All of the boatmen are part of the guild. These are free associations sprung from the needs of navigation. So they come from the industry, right? This is the kind of association organization that we're looking for. The right to these boats is adjusted by order of inscription at the navigation register. They had to follow one another in turn. So they sign up, first come, first serve, whatever, and then they all get in line. Now, here's the big deal. Nobody was allowed to get ahead of the others under pain from being excluded from the guild. That exclusion is a threat. Like, that exclusion is coercion in its own right. Now, to jump forward to where I was before, which was what, page 127? 137, right? He makes the same point here. When a railway company federated with other companies fails to fulfill its engagements, when its trains are late and goods lie neglected at the station, the other companies threaten to cancel the contract, and that threat usually suffices. Right? Needless to say, if that obligation were still to not be fulfilled, that threat would be carried out on. And that's coercive force, right? At the end of the day, you are harming that industry's bottom line, their ability to continue, their ability to do whatever. That's a threat. Like, I don't see how that's not coercion in the same way. And it really made me think of what we were talking about in conditions of the working class, where it's like murder, it remains,
Mm-hmm.
At the bottom. If not one of the thousands of our federations will receive you, whatever be their motive, you are absolutely incapable of producing anything useful. Or if you refuse to do it, then live like an isolated man or an invalid, right? Perhaps someone will take charity on you, but otherwise you're fucked, right? Otherwise you die. Otherwise we have killed you. Like, I don't see how that's not the same thing.
I feel like I have to think on that. My immediate reaction to that is to not equate coercion and a lack of cooperation. So, like, I think he's relying on social contract theory quite a lot here to make his definition of what cooperation actually means. I even have a couple of things where I wrote social contract theory on page 136,
mm-hmm.
because he says, let's take a group of volunteers combining for some particular enterprise, blah, 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 blah. Let's say there's one guy that frequently is absent from his post.
Yeah.
Must they, on his account, dissolve the group, elect a president to impose fines, and work out a code of penalties? All examples of what I think he would equate with some sort of state apparatus,
mm-hmm.
what we look to the state to do.
Yes.
And he goes on a little further down the page to say, if he hinders his comrades by his laziness or other defects, if he is quarrelsome, there is an end of it. He is compelled to leave the workshop. A certain standard of public morals is maintained in the same way. I think what his point is, we can quibble about the difference between coercion and lack of cooperation. I think maybe they're the same thing. I'd have to think on it a little bit.
It's a little weird because even in what you just said, he is compelled to leave the workshop. What if he says no? If you say get out of our workshop and then he says eat shit, then what?
Yeah, well, I think like Kropotkin's point is that if someone is non-cooperative, they no longer receive the cooperation of others.
They're societally murdered.
Maybe, I guess.
That's just how I'm feeling, man. Like, I hate to sound so smarmy, but like that's kind of like where I'm at. It's that same thing. It's not authority, but a commission. We've changed the name, and it's no longer coercion.
I mean, so again, I don't mean to pull in stuff from another book, but like in Mutual Aid, he talks a lot about. I feel like it's a colony of ants, and the idea of how they're all working in cooperation for this other thing. But if one of them chooses not to work, what ends up happening is that they get separated and they die.
Yeah,
because they're no longer cooperating and being a part of the cooperative whole that supports all of them.
Yeah.
I think that's what he's calling on, is the same sort of thing here. The contract is, we give you everything you need to survive.
Yeah.
And the response is you show up and you help in whatever way you can. If you don't, the contract is null and void.
Yeah.
That is, I guess, a form of coercion. But really what he's pointing out is that like people are not being cooperative, so we're not going to cooperate with them.
No,
I think his ultimate point is that you will cooperate.
Right. Yeah, I mean, much in the same way that he says, exploitation. Someone can't just come in and create an exploitative environment because no one will be there to be exploited.
Yeah. If your needs are met, you're no longer a target for that sort of exploitation.
And I mean, I think that's kind of. I'm not saying that it's a pipe dream, but I mean that's like a lofty ideal. The idea that we'll just take care of everyone and then no one will volunteer themselves to exploitation. I'm not here to quibble with Kropotkin on that because I think that is ultimately what everybody is talking about in like the withering away of the excess or and of the state even. One thing that made me chuckle when you were talking about the ants is it's really funny to me that Kropotkin is like this anti-Darwinistic thing. He's saying that we can come above nature. We don't have to have this kind of survival of the fittest struggle anymore. And then he constructs this kind of cooperative or else you die. Like it's like it's rather than adapt or die, it's like cooperate or die.
Where do you get an anti-Darwinist?
I'm not saying that he's anti-Darwin, like he's anti-evolution. It's just funny that he's going against that. He's saying that like the natural state of humans like doesn't need to be that way. Like we
act mutually.
Yeah, we can organize societally and create. It's not like a survival of the fittest scenario, but it is cooperate or die. I don't know. Now that you've said that, I'm like, wow, I'm an idiot.
Some time ago, before we got into this more specific thing about coercion, I had a thought where I wanted to kind of agree with you, but I don't remember. Number one, I also don't want to frame this conversation in like a debate bro kind of position, because I think that generally speaking, you and I agree on just about everything.
Pretty much. We're not taking positions here, y'all. Like,
yeah, and I also don't want to set us up as some like the anarchist versus the Marxist kind of thing, because I think that one is a mischaracterization and two is antithetical to the goal.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that in the bathroom. I was like, inside you, there are two communists. One is a Marxist-Leninist. The other is an anarchist. No, fucking Trotsky, man. But again, it's in between the maximum and the minimum program. That's going to be in my head now forever because it's like, I think it's really funny because if the answer is somewhere in between, then that entails some form of government, right? Like the anarchist is like the absolute negative of the government, like that completely anti-government position. Everything above that entails some form of government, though.
Yeah, I think that's where like anarcho-primitivism comes from, which I think is the pendulum swing a little too far in my estimation.
Blow it all up, dude. It's a shame that the schedule's kind of landed this way because I would have loved for April Fools to read something ridiculous like,
I wouldn't even have thought of that.
Yeah. I was like, next week we're going to read I don't know. Fucking something ridiculous.
Well, what's funny is we missed the publication of the last episode about the Paris Commune.
2 days. Yeah. 2 days before. I was gonna text you and be like, yeah. It was the 18th of March.
I was kind of bummed.
It's okay. Whatever.
Yeah. So what I was gonna say, I don't want this to be framed like as a anarchist versus Marxist kind of thing. And I certainly don't want to be the one that has to carry the torch for all anarchists or anything like that. But what I was going to say is that I think you're right that the maximum or minimum program, the answer lies somewhere in the middle. And my big takeaway from reading this text is that I think we need to keep Kropotkin's concerns about the state in the back of our minds as we are organizing whatever apparatus it is in that transitional stage of revolutionary tactics before we get to the classless, stateless, moneyless society that we all, including Kropotkin, hope to see. In large part, we need to keep that in mind because it is very, very possible, and he gives us many accounts of where it is possible and how it is possible, that transitional stage is where, what's the saying? Like you point a finger and three are pointing back at you. Like every accusation is a confession kind of thing. It creates an opportunity like, Stalin, it creates an opportunity where that transitional state can be usurped and become a state power that is exactly what, and in many ways worse than the state that we had envisioned destroying.
Yeah,
that was a long-winded way to say that. Like, I think we need to keep in mind the ideological opposition to the state while accepting the pragmatism of some form of state apparatus, at least in the transitional period.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily, the idea of pragmatism there is a little bit strange because there's something about pragmatism that seems like a reaction, you know? It's like
Really?
I'm reacting to current circumstances, and that's how I came to this action, to this conclusion.
Yeah, I specifically used the word pragmatism or the pragmatics, however I said it. I
Yeah.
specifically said that because the example of like, there's like a distribution system, a capitalist distribution system that exists right now.
Mhm.
That if we were to, the revolution were to occur, it doesn't make a lot of sense to just destroy that distribution system. It makes sense to use it as a means to distribute what is needed for the people.
Yeah.
There's a pragmatism to the use of that apparatus.
Yes. Okay. Pragmatism is a little weird, though. It's just seizing the current conditions, that can lead to some weird things. You know, how can we differentiate kind of a realpolitik, like reflecting our current circumstances towards like this ideal? There's like a push and pull there,
Mhm.
you know, like we have this ideal society in mind, then the reality of the thing is what actually happens. Like the Soviet Union, right? They had the idea of global revolution and then had to change their perceptions. They did state socialism, they did socialism in one country because that was the reality that was reflected around them,
Mhm.
onto them.
Yeah, imposed upon them.
Yeah. So something I was thinking about is that, like, it's again the same thing. It's like the anarchist ideal is the same ideal that we have, but that at the end of the day is the ideal. You know, how does the reality reflect that? And I hate to sound just like Kropotkin is saying, you know, works great on paper and poetry, but I don't know, man. Anarchism makes my head hurt. That's the problem. There's too many things to be like, what the fuck are you talking about? Now I can't think of anything. It's okay. We will just do it all. Part of me thinks that the world that Kropotkin envisions is just a simpler world. The online argument, sorry to bring Twitter into this, is that like the world is just too complex for anarchistic production. Like imagine that you need to get glasses and we live in an anarchist society, then what? Do you go to your buddy the glasses maker? Do you go to the Working Man's Glasses International Guild Federation and put your name on the list? That's the thing though, is that like, what does that look like? It's not like there's anarchist lens crafters, you know, I'm going down to the fucking hierarchy free Pearl Vision. No. That's the thing, you know, and that's something like glasses, you know, think about medicine. That's always the big one. People are like, what are you making Tylenol in your bathtub and then giving it to the community? You know, and I hate to use all of these like internet dunks, but like those are the questions that need to be answered, man. We, heavy air quotes, simply will not make Tylenol. You know, insulin is always the big one because it's like a critical need.
Yeah.
You know, my bathtub insulin. Also fucking food and drug regulations, man. Like, I'm so glad that I can go to my sink, turn on the tap, and drink the water without fear of dying for at least 40 years. Like, you know, maybe it will give me cancer eventually, but like, I'm not going to eat a turkey stick and have fiberglass in it or something. I don't know. I was thinking a turkey drumstick. Yeah, there you go. Just to get all of my internet-focused anti-anarchist thoughts out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes from the fact that there just isn't a lot, like you were saying, anarchism is not a particularly substantive philosophy in that they don't produce a theory of what they want. They produce a theory of what they're against, which leaves that as an open question. Yeah. I think it is a solvable, answerable question, but it's not one that has been specifically delineated by Kropotkin or thinkers like him.
I mean, I'm certainly interested in reading more anarchist thought. A big takeaway from this is that, like, I don't know, anarchists are cool and productive. And honestly, the internet arguments are stupid. We've said this before, but like in reality, anarchists are all very chill, very committed people. It's not so stupid as it is online.
Yeah, everything is amplified online to a degree that is preposterous.
Yeah.
What I appreciate about Kropotkin's approach to a more anarchist form of communism is, baby, I really appreciate that Kropotkin's approach, like his answer to the question, how does X get done, is fucking do it. Learn
Fucking
how to do it.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that as an ethos. And I think it's an easy stone to lob to say, like, well, what about this highly specific, very complicated thing in anarchism? Okay, that's fine. I'll accept that. You know, how is insulin going to be produced? How's it going to be distributed? Whatever. That's a question that should be answered, right?
Right.
But like the overwhelming number of questions or problems that need to be solved are easily solvable by like just fucking do it.
Just
Learn how to do it.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that that's his instinct. And again, coming from a punk hardcore DIY kind of school of thought, I get why that speaks to so many people as well. He talks a lot about like this kind of came up in the middle of his conversation about the brain work versus manual work thing and people's production of, he's talking about writers specifically.
Yeah,
it's like,
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, all the people that toil in the production of their books, the writers are looking down on them for all of their manual labor, but also they couldn't fucking do it. So.
Yeah. The quote I picked out on page 95.
Yeah.
Will literature lose by it? Will the poet be less a poet after having worked out of doors or having helped with his hands to multiply his own work?
Yeah.
I mean, that's exactly it. And I think that he talks about this a little bit in the division of labor, but I mean, that kind of jack of all trades kind of production is the ideal. We've said this before, but Marx says he could like toil in the day and then debate at night and, you know, fish in the afternoons. Like there's a multitude of things that can be done. I think it kind of goes, something we haven't mentioned yet is that Kropotkin advocates a 30-hour work week, which is crazy for the
4 to 5 hour work day.
Yeah, I think he says it's like he's 5 hour day. He's done the math. I really like that queer. Sorry, I got off track, but
it's not such a big deal. Most of this can't be done. I'm saying this as a one-man band who records everything myself. I write it all myself. I play every instrument. I record it all myself. Do right off who's gonna that happens. The answer is you. So do it.
No, I think that's fair. I think for one, a lot of times people at the top of their game are familiar with the entirety of the process, even if they're only involved in one part of it. I mean,
you would hope,
you know, that kind of knowledge lends itself to the kind of, I guess, skill merit that we're talking about. So I think that I agree with Kropotkin. In fact, when he's talking about the division of labor, he says that like early on, he says that harnessing a man to the machine kills their health and it dulls their mind. But even more so later when he talks about just manufacturing like one tip of a pen, you know, that will kill you basically. And it goes back to what he's saying about open and free association. It's like you should be able to do many things. You should be able to specialize in many things. And ultimately, people will settle into something that they like to do, that they want to do. And that want will increase their productivity. It will lend itself. You know, it's really a crazy thing that we're talking about the fact that it's not a production problem, it's a distribution problem when everyone's doing jobs that they hate. You know, it's like even in like this horrid, coerced, late stage environment, there is still so much being produced that like you can stock a Walmart, you know, like you can go to Kroger and get enough lettuce to feed a village, you know, like it's that kind of thing, even in jobs that people fucking hate. Imagine if everybody worked a job that they love. And I know that that's like the classic communist conceit, but it really is true. Like people will self-specialize. It doesn't have to be done for them. And in fact, doing it for them in that division of labor, which maybe goes into Kropotkin's vision of the state as well. Like maybe you're being ordered to go into this part of labor is a net negative. And I would agree with him.
Yeah. And the extension, you mentioned AI or robotics.
Yeah.
At a certain point, the technology exists for us today to do away with a lot of the jobs that are undesirable. I don't know the way to put it. That people work only out of coercive forces. Yeah. Very few people love flipping burgers. You know what I mean?
That's exactly the thought experiment I was about to pose, is that, you know, if the government were to put forth a subsidy and say, here's the front end capital for you to put in kiosks, right? The only thing you'll have to pay is the maintenance. How many McDonald's would say no? Because they would no longer have to pay their employees, right? I mean, like it's really just a matter of the cost. And just like I was saying earlier, like if we lived in a world where we cooperatively made it more expensive for jobs, they would start to do that. You know, I don't know. You can really see it now just because we had the two big strikes last year, the Writers Guild and the Screen Actors Guild. Now generative AI is part of that. And thank God the unions fucking fought for that, fought for those clauses in their contracts, because you could see very easily how quickly those places, those companies would say, fuck you, we'll just replace it with a machine.
Yeah, ideologically, the idea of AI is that it should replace or take over menial tasks to allow us more space for the creative tasks.
Yes.
And instead, it's being capitalized as a thing to take over creative tasks to avoid paying creatives. Remove the coercive force of capital, then that sort of stuff can be used for the betterment.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, the only reason it's not already replacing us is because it's not profitable to yet.
Currently.
Yet. Yeah. There was that new Netflix show, Late Night with the Devil or whatever, had a lot of flack because it had a lot of its set art AI generated. It's like that's a job that otherwise someone would have been paid for.
Yeah.
You know, the future looks grimmer and bleaker every second.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I hate to sound so nihilistic, but good God. We have a very slim window of time until they start doing like facial recognition in protests and like auto-targeting turrets in protests and that kind of thing, and then we truly will be done. Sorry.
Where's the lie? I have no objection to that. I mean, I have an objection, but I have no counterpoint to that. I can't disagree with that as the conclusion.
Yeah.
Never again!
Let's talk about well-being for all.
Absolutely.
Part of what I appreciate about Kropotkin's philosophy is this idea that everyone deserves to live a good life.
Absolutely.
And you're hard-pressed to find anyone that's going to argue against that from a philosophical sense, but that's the basis on which he builds the argument for communism or anarchism, his form of communist anarchism. And I think it's important for us to look at it a little bit.
Yes. He talks about from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, quite a bit. And he focuses particularly on that, you know, to each according to his need. Again, a big part of this that I really appreciate is that he says that we can do it. Even with what they had at the time, there is more than enough for everybody to be well taken care of.
Yep.
It's only through this history of robbery, enclosure, enforcement, that kind of thing that we've come to this situation.
I have a quote that I want to read for this, but this is a complete aside. Have you ever read the book Ishmael by Daniel Quinn?
No.
Okay. Anyway, on page 22.
Yes.
On page 22, Kropotkin says of the right to well-being or well-being for all, this is how he closes the second chapter. The right to well-being means the possibility of living like human beings and of bringing up children to be members of a society better than ours, whilst the right to work only means the right to be always a wage slave, a drudge, ruled over and exploited by the middle class of the future. So if you go through my book, you can see the pink highlights from the first time I read it and the red highlights from the second time that I read it. And that obviously, that might sound like something that's very foregone. What's the word I'm looking for? We take for granted that as a conclusion at this stage in our education as leftists. But when I was first reading this book, that spoke to me very deeply.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that I think has a zeal that can really light a spark in a person.
Yeah.
It did for me anyway.
I mean, not to be so cheesy about it, but like there's a reason that everyone loves the Three Musketeers, you know, all for one, one for all. Like that slogan was there. They were there for it.
That's good.
A little corny, but such
I like it.
It's just the case. It's a principle that everyone pretty much holds in your heart unless you're a soulless asshole that everyone can be taken care of.
Yeah, again, you can't argue against it on principle. And I think that that's a strength of the way Kropotkin presents his argument is he says, like, everyone deserves to live a good life, right? Everyone deserves to build a world for their children that's better than the world that they are currently living in, right?
He feels like a lawyer almost. He's like, don't you agree that, well, just one thing then, how are we still doing capitalism?
Exactly. I think that that's like, maybe this feels elementary or something like that, but I think that it's a very common sense way to build support for communism.
Yeah.
And it worked on me.
Yeah. I mean, you just peel the onion until you get to the point where there's a contradiction. And that contradiction is, you know, it's ultimately either resolved or ignored.
Yep.
I mean, that's it.
I guess this also has a lot to do with his talk about leisure and how we deserve. Okay. So I think he presents a world post-revolution where your needs are being met. Everyone has bread.
Yeah.
But that's not the only need that needs to be met for a person to live a life of well-being. They also need an opportunity to pursue leisure.
Yes.
He goes at great length to talk about that.
He has a whole chapter about luxury, the need for luxury, in fact. He says we must also strive to satisfy all manifestations of the human mind.
Yep.
See, that I like that you said that you have, reflecting on the last time I read this, you know, just like I was saying, then I was really caught up in all of the like, yes, everything for everyone. We can do it all. Now I'm like, okay, I get it. You know, like we've been new. Now what? You know, I guess that's kind of where my discontent is that it's like, okay, and you know, the and is always unanswered here.
So yeah, and I think there's a place for both.
Yeah. Listen, man, we're going to answer this question later, but everyone should read this.
Oh, fuck yeah.
I think absolutely. Right. Even if to give you like, I don't want to say a naive aspiration, but it's like, this is really the ultimate goal. This is really something that you could look at and be like, that is the ideal utopian society. And I think that, you know, there is a reason that Kropotkin gets called utopian so often. It's because like this truly is like the ideal society. Everyone is free to work in a job that is completely fulfilling to them. All of their needs are taken care of, not only physical, but also mental, right? They're working in a job that fulfills them mentally, emotionally, physically. They're living a life that does all of that, even if they don't work at all. All of these things are there, all of these things. One thing that really cracks me up is in the food chapter when he's like, we should really be giving all the luxuries to the sickest people.
Yeah.
You know, if truly this system worked the way it should, then like all the fucking invalids should get the caviar. That cracked me up because it's like, yeah, you're correct, you know, but there's just a difference in the way that value is computed, I suppose, you know. And even thinking about mental work, like mental stimulation, what people find fun, entertaining, satisfying is a reflection of the society we live in already. Is it so hard to imagine a society in which people want to work rather than one where they don't want to work? You know, where people are like, okay, I'm off to serve my community at the nuclear power plant or something. I don't know why that's the first one that I was thinking of Chernobyl there, where they're like, our mission is the goodness of all humanity. But I mean, that's the thing, you know, there's plenty of fucking freaks in this world, man. Someone will get in that sewer and they'll have a blast doing it.
Well, I mean, Office Space is a good example of that. There are people that are perfectly satisfied to work at Initech and like write fucking TPS reports.
But there is something, and I'm sorry to cut you off there, but there is something about like, will those jobs even exist? You know, something that Kropotkin says in here, two things is that one, there's a lot of stupid jobs in this fucking world that exist just because of complete sheer dipshittery. Dipshittery. And secondly, he says, this is a really interesting point here. This is the quote, because he says it once and then barely touches on it again. But on page 85, he says, the evil lies in the possibility of surplus value existing. Like there is a connection between the value that those jobs are creating and like that addition, like that surplus is ultimately unnecessary. It's a really interesting point that he makes there. Like I said, he says it once really and doesn't really touch on it again. But he's saying like the fact that we have a society where there is a surplus tells us that it's not being consumed at the rate it should be. Part of me is a little bit odd about that because we produce so much in this society that's completely asinine. But I don't know, a little bit weird there. It feels odd to constrain yourself like that. Maybe that's like the capitalist indoctrination, you know, that we're so worried of scarcity that we feel we have to hoard these goods.
Well, I think my take on that was back to the writer and the printing of their books, right? Like number one, if you're not going to print it yourself or are unable to print it yourself, there are means to have your books printed, and there are people that will happily do it because they enjoy, you know, that work or whatever. But there is also a lot of fucking drivel and bullshit that's getting produced and printed by those printers all of the time that is a total waste of their energy. That is no net positive, no net good for society. So you eliminate all of that sort of shit because we are already producing in surplus even under these sorts of conditions, right? But through the elimination of all of that bullshit, all of the little tchotchkes that get made that are a total waste of labor and factory time and all of that sort of stuff. You eliminate all of that, then you have, well, one, that's part of what makes it possible to sustain a 4 or 5 hour workday because we're only working the amount that we're working to produce fucking nothing. So you eliminate all of that. It reduces the amount of work that needs to be done. And you eliminate all of that to make room for the production of things that are actually societally uplifting and valuable. And one, that gives you more pride in the work, being a person that works in the production of that. And two, it becomes a self-sustaining thing where you're feeding into society things that enrich it, which makes it more likely to make more enriching things. So the cycle continues, you know?
Do you ever walk down an aisle at Walmart and you're like, man, there's a factory for every single one of these little fucking things?
I haven't been in a Walmart in over a decade.
Okay, that's fair.
But your point, yes.
Yeah.
I do think about that a lot.
Yeah. There's a dozen people employed making fucking kinetic sand or something, you know? This might be a strange example, but for video games, like think of the middest game you've ever played, okay? Absolute dog water, just complete drudgery, nothing. At the end, you feel nothing. Just like, why did I spend 8 hours doing that? Okay? Hundreds of people were paid a salary, a living wage to make that game.
Like to make it intellectually. And then there are also the people that are literally producing it.
That's who I was thinking of.
Yeah.
I was like, somebody had to code fucking Barbie Princess Playhouse Super Resort Island 3 for the Game Boy Advance. You know, like the most ridiculous thing is being made by hundreds of people.
Yeah.
That's the kind of surplus, that's that kind of waste that I think of when Kropotkin talks about those here. There was a quote I had here. I love it. It's on page 58. But provisions will run short in a month, our critics at once exclaim. So much the better, say we. It will prove that for the first time on record, the people have had enough to eat. Just thinking of, you know, it's just the Chad, yes.
Yeah.
It's like, well, we'll run out of food. Good. Maybe that was like I just had like a big bong hit thought where I was like, all this excess is why the people are starving, bro. Like the fact that people are in the factories making the dumb shit, it's because they're not in the factories making the good shit. Literally nothing. It's a dumb brain thought. I was thinking about the Paris Commune where Donnie Gluckstein says that people were getting like bread assistance. There were bread lines, basically. If those people already exist, then like what institutions are going to feed them otherwise? Maybe, I mean, why not both is my question to Kropotkin. Can't we have a means of feeding people who don't have a means of feeding themselves and also let people, like, I don't see why it has to be one or the other. They're not mutually exclusive. I mean, and, you know, why not have my anarchist soup kitchen organization in the other parish anyway? Like, if we're not doing a government to stop me, then who cares?
Well, the soup kitchen thing, I think, is interesting because he has a couple of takes that I just wrote feminism next to, because he is, I would argue, a very clear proto-feminist. Because he's an egalitarian, a lot of what he has to say about food, he's talking specifically about like wasted labor and labor discrimination that's being formed against women because their labor is not seen as valuable or necessary, even though it is literally the labor that was sustaining people, you know, like making food, taking care of that sort of shit. But he makes a point about why have 50 women make 50 meals as opposed to have one kitchen making meals for everyone to free up time for leisure and interest. He's an author.
It's like and it's, you know, 1897 when worthwhile text to read, especially are for state, like if you're pro state, because one, it'll challenge those ideas. Street alternative, it also deal in mind. Sincerely, to play that, but I like conflict, interest, idiot, whatever. He does.
Would echo again clear things, ways that century before our conversation.
We already said, but give us who touch the bell if you hit the like bell. Spike. No, what the fuck? There's no good exit. Wait, we'll do this.
What are we doing?
I don't know. I was really trying to think of something quickly.
Hoping it would come to us.
Yes. Oh, inside you there are two. One of them is Stalin's strongest soldier. The other is Trotsky reborn. So Godspeed, God bless. Workers of the world unite. See you later.
Let them have bread. Well, I mean, anarchists love to dumpster dive.
I bet they do. No, I'm so sorry.